Chapter 2. Salomoncino da Piove di Sacco, predatory financier. Salomoncino da Piove had 4 sons and a daughter. His family, in addition to managing the Volta dei Negri lending banks of Piove di Sacco and Padua, had major joint interests in other banks operating in Verona, Ferrara, Montagnara, Soava, Monselice, Cittadella, Bassano, and Badia Polesine, and was active in the textiles and precious stone trade, a secret and elite clientele ranging from the Sforza at Milan to the Soranzo of Venice came to them for huge sums. Mercutio, Salomone's firstborn son, when not operating in Piove di Sacco and Padua, supported by his brothers, stayed at Venice to assist his father in the company set up with David Mavrogonato and to take over their functions when they accompanied the merchant from Candia in his maritime missions, which were conducted more or less secretly. He was in the city of the lagoons in the autumn of 1466, as well as in the first half of the following year. Thus, he was there in 1468, at the beginning of 1469, during the imperial visit of Friedrich III, and in 1473. While Salomone was considered a bold and nonchalant businessman, his firstborn Mercutio, and above all his other son Salomoncino, darkened his reputation, at least in this respect. Mercutio was famous to all for his overbearing boastfulness. It was said that, in that of Padua, he used to brag of his strength, real or presumed, with resounding threats. "There is no Christian who would have had the temerity to touch me with one finger and would not have gotten a good hiding from a couple of well-armed ruffians." Mercutio, who lived at Padua facing the Parenzo or Volta dei Negri, at least until the end of the winter of 1473, made his appearance as an officially approved moneylender at Montagnana in 1475. He was still to be found in that financial centre at the beginning of the summer of 1494, when Bernardino da Feltre arrived there to preach. On that occasion, Mercutio did not hesitate to strut about on the piazza with a defiant air, where the violent and fiery Friar da Feltre was expected to preach. As a result, Mercutio was soon recognized by a Christian who insulted him, and the whole affair terminated in a sensational brawl, with a mutual exchange of fisticuffs, at the culmination of which the infuriated Mercutio threateningly unsheathed his dagger. It is not surprising that he was to find himself imprisoned in the prisons of the Republic with relative frequency. Mercutio could nevertheless still count on the influential protection of the city of Venice, which protection he had inherited, together with the privileges obtained by his father Salomone da Piove. In April 1480, the Council of Ten declared him a fidelis noster civis, loyal citizen of Venice, under the terms of a law approved by the Serenissima at the end of 1463 on the protection of Jewish moneylenders. We know that his father chose to live in Venice during this same period, and it is not difficult to believe that this law was in some way the product of some self-interested initiative. But it was Salomoncino, his brother, who maintained uncontested primacy in this poorly regulated financial sector, where transactions took place with the underworld, and the law was only obeyed in those rare cases in which its defenders refused large bribes. Salomoncino took over the management of the bank at Piove di Sacco after 1464, when his father took up a more or less stable residence at Venice for the purpose of looking after Mavrogonato's interests, although, as we shall see, he seems to have taken up provisional residence at Verona in the years 1470 to 1480. In 1474, the Duke of Milan ordered an inquiry of Salomoncino and his suspected accomplices, all accused of illegally purchasing and selling pearls, despite the legal provisions prohibiting Jews from engaging in this trade. Salomoncino had already experienced serious legal problems. In 1472, two common criminals, Giovanni Antonio da Milano and Abbondio da Como, were arrested in Venice under the accusation of importing large quantities of counterfeit silver coin from Ferrara and selling it in Venice, earning large profits. This fraudulent trade was operated through a front operation, a butcher shop owned by a certain Nicola Fugazzone, butcher at Venice, at San Cassian, and a Jewish intermediary, Zaccaria di Zacco, who had his provisional residence in Venice and was responsible to Salomoncino, moneylender at Piove di Sacco. The police authorities succeeded in laying their hands on all members of the gang, and they were tried before the judges of the Municipal Avogadri of Venice on 29 May 1472. The two criminals from Lombardy, Giovanni Antonio and Abbondio, were sentenced to the cruel amputation of the right hand, the loss of an eye, a fine of 500 ducats in gold each, and were banned in perpetuity from Venice and all the territories of the Republic. The sentence was carried out publicly on the same day in the usual place, the Piazza San Marco, between the columns of San Marco and San Todoro, where the waters of the lagoon washed the pavement. The butcher Nicola and one accomplice, Lorenzo Paolo, were condemned to 1 year's imprisonment and banned from Venice for 8 years. Paolo was also fined 100 ducats. The intermediary Zaccaria, considered Salomoncino's enforcer, was sentenced to 1 year's imprisonment, in addition to the fine of 200 gold ducats. After serving the sentence, he is said to have been banned from Venice and its territories for 8 years. Salomoncino was obviously linked to the shady traffic at both ends, at Ferrara, where his family had a bank, and where the counterfeiters operated, sending the counterfeit coins to Venice via their couriers, and at Piove di Sacco, where Salomoncino usually resided, and where the counterfeit coins were usually shipped before being distributed to retailers. Arrested and subjected to torture, Salomoncino signed a confession and admitted that he had earned a profit of 10% from the trade in counterfeit coin. The Venetian judges sentenced him to 6 months' imprisonment and the huge fine of 3,000 gold ducats, 2,000 payable to the arsenal, and the remaining 1,000 payable to the Avogadria di Comune. Furthermore, the banker from Piove was banned for 10 years from Venice and the surrounding district, as well as from Padua and the territory of Padua. In the event of violation of the ban, the penalty of another year's imprisonment and a further fine of 1,000 gold ducats was provided for, while, on the one hand, Salomoncino may have more or less voluntarily submitted to the fine and perhaps to the imprisonment. At the same time, he is thought to have found a way, and it is not difficult to imagine how, to evade the ban, at least in part. At the end of the year, he was already active again at Soave and Verona. 5 years later, as we shall see, he firmly resumed management of the bank at Piove di Sacco and the Volta dei Negri bank at Padua. The wolf had lost a few tufts of fur, but not his teeth. According to records written by the Paduan orator Girolamo Campagnola in 1480, Salomoncino was then presumably resident at Verona, and once again found himself in prison at the disposition of the Council of Ten, under the accusation of selling clipped and counterfeit coin, a charge which he was able to evade in part by shifting the blame onto an accomplice, a miserable brigand from Verona, who ended up at the stake. Oh, Salomoninco da Piove, Salomoncini's father, was dead by the beginning of 1477. Maestro Valco, the Jewish physician who had received the assignment, obviously for pay, of assassinating Mohammed II at the behest of the Serenissima, had in the meantime returned to Venice, presumably to render account to his instigator of the progress of the plot. At Venice, or during the course of his voyage from Constantinople, the physician had been informed that Salomoncini was no longer alive. Understandably anxious about the continued existence of the mission, but, above all, because he feared for his pay, which had been promised by the now-deceased banker, Valco set out to track down Salomoncini, returning rapidly to Piove di Sasso. At first, Salomoncini was thunderstruck. But then, examining his father's records, he found clear evidence of the contract signed with the homicidal physician in the past. As a practical and alert person, Salomoncini was immediately aware that Valco possessed the necessary talents to carry out the hazardous mission of assassinating the Great Turk successfully. At the same time, he weighed all the potential benefits to be derived from future relations with the government of Venice. At this point, Salomoncini did not hesitate to assume responsibility for continuation of his father's commitment from both the strategic and financial points of view. On 9 July 1477, he officially informed the Council of Ten of his resolution to do so, making it to appear an act of disinterested devotion to the Republic. Obviously, in 1470, Salomone da Piove, perhaps inheriting a project initially dreamed up by Mavrocordato, suggested that Maestro Valco should carry out the plan to take the life of the Great Turk. By 1480, a period of 10 years believed sufficient for the task. Salomoncini, rejoining the ranks of the conspiracy, ensured the city of Venice that the task would indeed be carried out during the stipulated time period, and that Mohammed II would meet the death he deserved at Valco's hands in less than 2½ years. Maestro Valco, a Jewish physician, who returned and finding the said Salomon, a Jew who kept the Banco da Pieve, to be dead, turned to Salomoncini, son of the said Salomon, and having informed him of the matter, and Salomon, examining the books, found this to be the case. Not wishing to be a lesser servant of your most illustrious lordship than he who was my father, and having learned from the said Maestro Valco, Jewish physician, of that which had happened to the person of the Great Turk, Salomoncini examined the said Maestro Valco, and having witnessed his courage and intelligence, and being convinced of his determination, being the slave and servant of your most illustrious lordship, as was his father, without costing your most illustrious lordship 1 penny, offers to send the said Maestro Valco, with all things requested by the said Valco, at Salomoncini's own expense, and is certain that the said Maestro Valco will kill the said Lord Turk by the end of 28 May, which matter will be to the glory of this illustrious state and all Christianity. It goes without saying that Salomoncini was not entirely disinterested. In exchange for these services, because in so doing he acts in danger of his life, which cannot be repaid with money, if the mission ended successfully, Salomoncini, following in Mavrocornato's footsteps, asked Venice for a few privileges, including an annual provision of 2,000 florins, the beneficiaries of which are said to have included Salomoncini, Maestro Valco, and their descendants in perpetuity, the entitlement of occupying themselves with some branch of trade, request that the said Salomoncini and his brothers, with their descendants, be permitted to deal in trade in this terrain, as any gentleman may do, a privilege generally prohibited to Jews, and to purchase real property at Venice and its dominions, up to a total value of 25,000 ducats. Salomoncino, who was certainly not lacking in healthy doses of impudence in addition to an uncommon dose of greed, furthermore requested that he be permitted to open lending banks modelled on the example of those operating at Mestre, and, in particular, one in the much sought-after piazza of the island of Murano, intending that one of these locations be understood to refer to Murano. He finally requested that he enjoy immunity from any possible future bans issued by the Venetian authorities against him personally or any member of his family. The Council of Ten officially accepted Salomoncino's petitions, but on the condition that the granting of the privileges be subject to the presentation of certain proof of the death of Mahomet II at the hands of Maestro Valco. But things turned out differently. In 1480, Mahomet II was still alive, despite the efforts of Valco and Simoncino to bring about a contrary state of affairs, while Venice, concerned with the pressure of the Turkish armies on its confines, had already signed a peace treaty with the Sublime Porte a year before. The Sultan then terminated his earthly existence in 1481, in all probability as the result of perfectly natural causes. Salomoncino's financial plans and those of his family, linked to the ambitious plot which had failed miserably, therefore appeared definitely on the wane. Either something or someone had moved the city of Venice to grant the benefits requested by Salomoncino, at least in part. In fact, we know that the government of Padua in 1495, under pressure from the Weavers' Guild, had requested Venice to abrogate the privileges enjoyed by Salomoncino and his family at Piove di Sacco and Padua. Even more interesting is the confirmation that much later, in 1557, a certain Salomon, a Jew, a certain Marcusio, known as da Muran, was called upon to testify in a trial held before the Holy Office at Venice. This Salomon was certainly a descendant of Salomone da Piove, or, to be more exact, a nephew of his son Giacobbe. The fact that he was known as the Jew of Muran is an indication, not to be undervalued, in support of the hypothesis that the plan to open a lending bank on the island of Murano, strongly desired by Salomoncino, had in some way succeeded, for reasons unknown to us. During the second half of the 15th century, the family of Salomone da Piove and the Campo San Piero was experiencing the ups and downs of the lone market sector at Padua, enjoying undisputed hegemony within the local Jewish community. It was in 1453, precisely in the palace of Salomone di Mercutio da Cividale, who is later believed to have become the famous Salomone da Piove at Padua in the Santo Stefano district, that Salomone Levi had taken over the ownership of the Bank of Campo San Piero, thus initiating his fortunate career as a high-ranking banker. But the unforeseen and disagreeable presence of a certain someone constituted grounds for disturbance and concern. After the Jewish banks of Padua were officially closed in 1455, a Swiss Jew appeared in the city in the early summer of 1464, not concealing his own intentions, and above all without having asked and obtained the implicit and apparently indispensable authorization of the powerful bankers of Piove and Campo San Piero. The Swiss Jew was Aaron de Jacob, a Jew from Wil, north of Zurich, a short distance from Schaffhausen on the Rhine, a village located at the boundary between the Swiss Confederation and Germany. Aaron had decided to move to the strategic Venetian financial center in search of money and fortune, dragging his two brothers, Vita and Benedetto, along with him. Furthermore, around 1471, just as other Jewish bankers had already done in the district, in 1468, Aaron obtained authorization to carry on activity as approved lender at Padua, 3 days in the week, ultimately freeing himself from this de facto restriction. He thus began to operate the Bank del Duomo with undeniable success, despite the powerful cartel of his adversaries. It should not surprise us that in the spring of 1472, an anonymous denunciation, easily attributable to the entourage of bankers of Piove and Campo San Piero, noted that Arone's bank, against all the regulations, had kept its doors open on Sunday in open violation of the Christian religion. In the summer of 1473, Salomone da Piove, in a dispute with Mattia, lender of the Paduan Bank of San Lorenzo, appointed as arbiter a friend of the family, i.e. Jacob, the son of Salomone da Campo San Piero. Representing the adverse party was Arone, who did not bother to conceal his own enmity towards the powerful bankers of Piove and Campo San Piero. A few years later, in 1476, the Swiss Jew saw himself compelled to sell the two banks owned by him, the Del Duomo Bank at Padua and the bank at Monsalite, to Abramo di Bonaventura, a Jew of Ashkenazi origin, from Ulm, Germany. Abramo hastened to fall in line with the Paduan cartel of Jewish bankers, particularly Jacob, Salomone di Padova's son, and Simone Salomone da Campo San Piero's son, who already controlled the two most important banks in the town centre of Padua, the Volto dei Negri Bank and the Bank of San Lorenzo, since 1472. Exactly who formed this powerful cartel emerges clearly from the negotiations between the Republic of Venice and the Paduan Jewish bankers in 1486, including Jacob da Piove, Simone da Campo San Piero, Abramo da Ulm, and Isacchetto Finzi. Aron appears not to have been very successful in the difficult business of lending money at interest, both at Padua and Monsalis, and obstacles were placed in his way on many occasions, and it was a consolation to him that he had not been broken or killed. Aronen had already restricted his activity to that of rag paper making as early as 1473. A few years later, he attempted to invest the modest sums he had been able to scrape together from the sale of his bank in a safe manner. Aronen, the Swiss Jew from Will, had arrived at Padua as an outsider, bold and without resources, at least in the eyes of Piove and Campo San Piero. Salomone da Piove's impatient and fiery sons had their pockets full and were waiting for Aron to hit bottom. In 1481, Salomoncino da Piove dreamed up a colossal swindle, this time to the detriment of other Jews, to rake in money by the wheelbarrow full. In cahoots with David di Anselmo, known as David Schwab, he secretly decided to transfer the savings invested by Paduan Jews in the bank at Soathe to the bank at Piove di Sacco, owned by David di Anselmo. These savings amounted to a huge sum, as much as 1,500 ducats in gold, belonging to Paduan Jews from the lower middle classes, mostly small investors and savers. The victims of the inevitable deliberate collapse of the Banco di Soave included rabbis, students, widows, and other poor people, among them the unfortunate Aron de Will, who had deposited the money collected from the sale of his banks there in 1476. Aron, acting on behalf of the other victims of the fraud as well, had the Banco di Soave agent, Jacob di Lazzaro, arrested. This same agent was still in jail at the end of 1485, when he finally succeeded in obtaining his release after withdrawing part of the money earlier stolen via Salomoncino's bank and returning it to Aron. But he was obviously the smallest fish of the lot. David Schwab went bankrupt with his pockets full in an artful financial crash thought up in league with the negligent bankers of Piove, who had gotten their hands on a notable slice of the money embezzled from the tills of the Banco di Soave. But Schwab was pursued by a religious interdict pregnant with consequences, handed down against him by Rabbi Anshel Asher Enchkin, who had lost more than 1,000 ducats entrusted to him for investment by persons of modest wealth. Enchkin publicly unmasked Schwab, who had declared bankruptcy notwithstanding the fact that he still had all the money. The religious condemnation handed down by Enchkin was approved and subscribed by some of the most influential rabbis of Germany. Nor did Aron de Will intend to stop attempting to bring an action directly against Salomoncino da Piove and his Paduan accomplices. In the spring of 1481, the two contending parties, by common accord, decided to submit to the arbitration of two Jews of German origin, residents of the region of Padua. The two arbitrators were the rabbis Isaac Ingdam and Viviana de Vacheron, residents of the Duomo and Sancantian districts at Padua respectively. Obviously the final award, expressed in accord with the legal system in use at Venice, was far from satisfactory to Salomoncino, who was, on several occasions during the following years, obliged to face his exasperating and implacable rival in court. In the end, the Piove di Sacco banker lost his patience, which he must not have possessed in excessive doses, and decided to take the law into his own hands, freeing himself from what he now considered an enemy to be eliminated. In the winter of 1487, Salomoncino sent a hired killer to Venice, where Aron was staying at that time, with the assignment of getting rid of Aron without a trace. In a night in January, Isaiah Teutonico, known as Salomoncino's servant and bodyguard, attacked the impoverished Aron from behind, just as Aron was leaving the Jewish hospice at San Polo, before he could reach his son-in-law's home a few islands away. Aron was struck on the head with an edged weapon and left to die on the ground in a pool of blood. Aron, despite a serious head wound and skull fracture, survived the attack and later denounced his unknown aggressor. A reward was immediately placed on the attacker's head, and his identity was quite soon discovered by the police authorities. On 22 May 1488, the would-be killer, Isaiah, who had in the meantime prudently taken flight, was tried in absentia and banned in perpetuity from Venice and its territories. If he was captured, he was to suffer a particularly cruel fate. Dragged to the scene of the crime, he was to lose his right hand, after which, with his own hand appended to his neck, he was to be conducted to the Piazza San Marco and publicly beheaded between the two usual columns. Once the attacker was identified, it was child's play for the Venetian city authorities to identify the instigator, the unscrupulous businessman from Piove di Sacco, who had already served more than one term in the prisons of the Republic. Finding himself unmasked, Salomoncino spontaneously appeared at the public prosecutor's office, admitting to commissioning the crime and paying the killer to commit it. He then excused himself by saying that the victim had never ceased importuning him, dragging him through one long, exhausting judicial dispute after another, until, driven to his wits' end, he had decided to free himself from the intolerable nuisance once and for all. Salomoncino got off with a relatively mild sentence. which is not surprising in view of the type of relationship linking him, more or less obviously and officially, with the Venetian authorities. In the end, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, in commutation of which he would be banned from Venice and its territories for 4 years, in addition to the payment of a fine of 200 gold ducats, to be paid partly to the Hospital of Piety. But Salomoncino was back at work as early as 1 year later, in 1489, managing his network of banks at Piove di Sacco and Padua. In 1495, the municipality of Padua petitioned the Republic of Venice to revoke the chapters of the loan granted to Salomoncino, as well as all related privileges, but Venice refused. As mentioned by Marin Sanudo in his diaries, in 1499 Salomoncino da Piove di Sacco was one of the Jewish bankers engaged in negotiations with Venice for the concession of the huge sum of 15,000 ducats to be pledged by the Republic in the Turkish matters, i.e. the war effort against the Sublime Porte. Salomoncino, who had intended to remain at Piove di Sacco at least until 1504, according to Sanudo, was definitively expelled from the city of Venice 1 year later, allowing the city to breathe one last sigh of relief. Salomoncino's memory, ambiguous and disturbing, was then lost in the mists of the lagoons of Venice.